The charge hit Margot Ellison's credit card at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, while she was sitting in a budget meeting she hadn't called and didn't want to attend. $9,400. Merchant, Hargrove & Sons, Estate Attorneys. Authorization code confirmed. She set her phone face down on the conference table. Across from her, her son-in-law Devin was talking about the need to liquidate certain legacy assets before the estate closed. He said legacy assets, the way people say words they've recently learned. Her daughter Faye sat beside him, nodding at whatever he said, the way she'd been nodding at whatever he said for 4 years. Margot waited until the meeting was over. Then she made a call. The thing about Margot Ellison was that she drove a 10-year-old Camry. She wore her hair in a low ponytail she'd done herself. She owned exactly 2 pairs of shoes she considered nice. One for court, one for everything else. She had not been to a salon in 6 months. She ate her lunch at her desk most days, a turkey sandwich she made at home, because she genuinely did not see the point of spending $18 on a salad someone else assembled. People made assumptions. People had always made assumptions. At 61, Margot had stopped correcting them. She had sat on the federal bench for 14 years. Before that, 22 years of civil litigation that had taken her into courtrooms in 11 states and produced 3 landmark rulings that law students still read. She had clerked for a Supreme Court justice when she was 25 years old and too stubborn to be intimidated. She had been, for a brief period in her late 40s, the person you called when something was on fire and you needed it not to be. None of that was visible in the parking lot of the Whole Foods, where she bought her coffee every morning, or at the dry cleaner on Meridian where she brought her robes. It wasn't visible at her daughter's house, where she sat at holiday dinners and passed the rolls and listened to Devin talk about his real estate portfolio, while Faye refilled wine glasses that didn't need refilling. It wasn't visible until it needed to be. Margot had met Devin Carver 3 days before Faye introduced him as her boyfriend. She'd met him at a deposition, his deposition, as it happened, in a civil case involving a property dispute. She'd been there as a private consultant, which she took on occasionally for cases that interested her. She remembered that he'd been evasive and that his attorney had been worse. She had not made the connection immediately when Faye brought him to Thanksgiving. People looked different outside of conference rooms. By the time she recognized him, Faye was already wearing a ring he'd put on layaway. Margot had said nothing. She had watched instead, which she was good at. For 4 years she had watched Devin Carver manage his wife's inheritance the way a man manages something he believes is already his. Faye's father, Margot's ex-husband, Leonard, had died 18 months into the marriage, and Leonard had left behind a house, a brokerage account, and a small commercial property in Riverside that threw off rental income every quarter, modest by some standards, significant by any honest accounting. Faye had never been particularly interested in money. That had been fine when she was younger. It was less fine now that there was money to be interested in, and a husband who had strong opinions about where it should go. Margot had watched the commercial property get refinanced. She had watched the brokerage account migrate to a firm Devin recommended. She had watched Faye sign things at the kitchen table while Devin stood behind her, pointing at lines. She had said, twice, that Faye should have an independent attorney review documents before signing them. Faye had smiled in the particular way. She smiled when she thought her mother was being difficult, which was a smile she'd learned from her stepfather and never unlearned. The $9,400 charge changed the calculation. Margot had one credit card she'd had since 1997. It had a modest limit, a low rate, and she used it for specific recurring expenses: her bar association dues, her professional liability insurance, and the annual fee for the legal research database she'd used since before most people in her daughter's social circle had finished high school. She did not use it for much else. She had not authorized any charge to Hargrove & Sons estate attorneys. She sat in her car in the parking structure adjacent to the federal courthouse and pulled up the number for her credit card's fraud department. While she was on hold, she opened the firm's website on her phone. Hargrove & Sons was a boutique estate planning and probate firm, mid-size, good reputation. They had an office in the downtown high-rise where Devin kept a mailbox and called it a professional address. She told the fraud department to put a hold on the card. Then she asked them to send her a full transaction history for the prior 60 days. There were 2 other charges she didn't recognize: a filing fee from a county probate court, a notary service in the same zip code as Hargrove and Sons. Together, the 3 charges totaled just under $11,000. Margot sat with that for a moment. Her ex-husband's estate had closed. The probate had been straightforward. She'd reviewed the filings herself, not as an attorney of record, but as a careful woman who read what she was given. Everything had been distributed. The house had been sold. The brokerage account had been rolled over. The commercial property was still generating income, held now in Faye's name. Or it had been. She called her former law partner, a man named Aldrich, who had gone into estate and trust litigation when his knees gave out and he could no longer reliably stand for 6-hour trial days. She described what she'd found. He was quiet for a moment. "When did the commercial property last generate a distribution?" he asked. Margot thought about it. "October," she said. Faye mentioned it in passing. "And before that, March, regular, and nothing since October? Not that I've heard." Aldrich was quiet again. "You want me to pull the county records?" "I want you to pull everything," she said. She drove home. She made dinner. She did not call Faye because she had learned that calling Faye before she had the full picture produced nothing useful. Faye would ask Devon, and Devon would have an explanation, and the explanation would be smooth and slightly complicated, and would conclude with some implication that Margot didn't understand the situation because she was not a real estate professional, which was Devon's way of reminding everyone at the table that he was. Aldrich called back the next morning with a PDF attached to his email. The commercial property on Riverside had been transferred by deed into a limited liability company. The LLC had been registered in Nevada. The registered agent was a service company with no meaningful identity. The managing member, according to the operating agreement filed with the state, was a trust. The trust had been created 8 weeks ago. The trustee was Devon Carver. There was no indication that Faye had been told. There was also a second filing, from a different county, that Aldrich had found by running Devon's name through a broader search. A deed of trust on a property Margot didn't recognize. A single-family home in the East County, purchased 18 months ago, with a down payment that appeared to have come from a wire transfer originating at the brokerage account where Leonard's money had been parked. Margot poured the rest of her coffee down the sink. She wasn't angry yet. She was in the phase that came before angry, the cold, focused phase, the one she'd learned to recognize in herself over decades of depositions and trials, and moments where the facts on the page said something that no one in the room wanted to hear. She called her daughter. Faye answered on the 3rd ring, slightly distracted. The sound of a podcast paused in the background. They talked for 11 minutes. Margot asked questions about the Riverside property, framed as casual, as if she'd just been thinking about it. She asked about the brokerage account. She asked carefully whether Faye had signed anything recently related to her father's estate. Faye said she didn't think so. Then she said, well, there had been some paperwork Devon brought home a few weeks back, something about restructuring for tax purposes, but she hadn't really read it because Devon had explained it was routine. Margot said that sounded sensible. Then she said she'd talk to Faye soon. Then she called Aldrich and told him to find her a forensic accountant. What happened next took 3 weeks and was not dramatic in any outward way. Margot did not confront Devon at the dinner table. She did not arrive unannounced with a process server. She did not, as she had seen people in her situation portrayed in stories designed to satisfy, deliver a speech about justice in a voice that trembled with feeling. She filed a motion in County Superior Court. Then she filed a complaint with the State Bar. Then she sent a letter, through Aldrich, on firm letterhead, to Hargrove and Sons, which had processed paperwork using an authorization that bore Faye's signature on documents Faye could not recall reviewing. The Hargrove partner who called back within 3 hours was named Castillo. He was polite. He was also, Margot could hear, frightened. She did not say anything that would alarm him unnecessarily. She simply described what the forensic accountant had found and asked if he would prefer to cooperate voluntarily or receive a subpoena. He cooperated voluntarily. 2 things happened in the first week. The county court issued a temporary restraining order freezing any transfer or encumbrance of the assets connected to Leonard's estate. and a senior associate at Hargrove & Sons, a young woman named Fenn who had processed the original paperwork and had apparently been having doubts about it since before Margot's call, provided a voluntary statement. Faye found out on a Thursday evening. Margot had asked if they could talk, in person, without Devon present. Faye had agreed, though she'd seemed uncertain about why. They sat at the kitchen table in Margot's house, the one Faye had grown up in, and Margot laid out what she'd found the same way she would have laid out evidence in a conference room, methodically, with documents. Faye was quiet for a long time afterward. "He told me it was all for tax purposes," she said. "I know he did. He said you'd try to make it seem like something it wasn't. He said you'd done it before with other things." Margot looked at her daughter. "He said I'd done this before. He said you liked to find problems where there weren't any, that it was a control thing." Faye's hands were flat on the table. "I believed him. I'm sorry. I believed him." Margot said nothing immediately. She looked at her daughter's hands on the table. Faye had her father's hands, long-fingered, slightly restless, always wanting something to hold. "You didn't have any reason not to," Margot said, "and you have every reason to be furious with me for the things I didn't say loudly enough, early enough. I should have been clearer. You told me to have someone review documents. I should have told you why." They sat with that for a while. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator made the sound refrigerators make. "What happens to Devon?" Faye asked. "That will depend on what he does in the next few weeks and what the DA's office decides to pursue. Aldrich says the civil exposure alone is significant." Margot paused. "The property in the East County, the one purchased with your father's money, is in Devon's name only. You are not on any of those documents, which means you are not liable for anything he did. That's important." Faye closed her eyes. "He was going to leave me, wasn't he?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Margot didn't answer that. Some questions were better not answered, because the answer existed in the silences already, and adding words would only make it heavier. "The Riverside property is still legally yours," Margot said. "The deed transfer wasn't properly executed. Hargrove's associate caught that in her own review. The LLC will be dissolved. The income should start again in the next quarter. And the brokerage account? Aldrich is working on that. He thinks we can recover most of it. The wire to the East County property is recoverable as a fraudulent transfer under state law. It won't be quick, but it's recoverable." Faye nodded. She looked like someone who had been told that the damage to a house could be fixed and was trying to make herself believe that houses could in fact be fixed. "Mom," she said, "those charges on your credit card, already disputed, they'll be reversed. He used your card without—" "Yes. How did he even have the number?" Margot thought about the Thanksgiving 5 years ago when she'd given Faye her credit card to use for a hotel booking, when Faye's card had been temporarily frozen. Small things, the ways you trusted people because someone you loved trusted them first. "It doesn't matter how," Margot said. "What matters is that it stopped." Devon Carver retained an attorney 11 days after Aldrich's letter arrived at Hargrove & Sons. His attorney sent a response suggesting that any improprieties were the result of miscommunication and that Devon had at all times acted in Faye's best interest as her spouse, which was the same sentence restructured 3 different ways across 4 pages. Aldrich forwarded it to Margot with a single line. Classic. The civil case moved at the pace civil cases moved, which was glacially, deliberately, in the manner of a process designed to produce resolution without urgency. Margot did not try to speed it up. She had been in litigation long enough to know that patience was not a passive virtue, it was an active one, the kind that required you to sit still while the other side made mistakes. Devon's attorney, it turned out, was not particularly good. He filed an opposition to the asset freeze that included a factual claim that was easily contradicted by the very documents he had attached as exhibits. Margot noted this without comment. Aldrich noted it with considerable comment, in a reply brief that was 23 pages and meticulous. The Superior Court judge who heard the matter was a woman named Tran, whom Margot had appeared before 20 years ago in a different context. They were not friends and had not been in contact, but Margot respected her. Judge Tran had a reputation for reading everything she was given, which was rarer than it should have been. At the hearing, Devon sat at the respondent's table in a suit that was too new and expensive for a county courtroom. His attorney spoke for 12 minutes and used the phrase family financial planning 4 times. When it was Aldrich's turn, he spoke for 6 minutes and introduced 3 exhibits. One of them was the deed of trust on the East County property. One of them was a bank wire confirmation. One of them was the voluntary statement from Hargrove's associate. Judge Tran extended the restraining order and scheduled a follow-up hearing for 60 days out. In the hallway afterward, Devon said, loudly enough that 2 clerks and a paralegal could hear him, that Margot had orchestrated this entire situation because she had never liked him and had always wanted to control Faye's life. Margot looked at him. "Devon," she said, "I've sat on the federal bench for 14 years. I have signed orders that changed the lives of people far more formidable than you. I don't have any interest in controlling your wife's life. I have an interest in making sure she doesn't lose her inheritance to someone who forged her authorization on a real estate transfer." She let a beat go by. "Good luck with the rest of this." She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. She heard him, behind her, start to say something to his attorney. Then she heard the attorney say something quietly in response. Then silence. The elevator doors opened, and she got in. The East County property was eventually recovered as a fraudulent transfer. It took 11 months from the date of the original filing. The brokerage account recovery took longer, 16 months. And they did not get all of it back, because one tranche of funds had been moved through an instrument that complicated the paper trail in ways that even the forensic accountant found impressive in a grim way. But they recovered enough for the Riverside property to be clear and generating income again, enough for Faye to start over with something rather than nothing. Faye filed for divorce 8 weeks after the Thursday evening at the kitchen table. She moved into an apartment near her mother's house. She took a job she'd been offered 2 years earlier and turned down because Devon had said the hours would be hard on their schedule. The hours were, in fact, hard. She seemed to find this satisfying in a way she couldn't entirely explain. On a Sunday afternoon in March, she came over to Margot's house, and they sat in the backyard, and Faye brought coffee from the place on the corner that Margot could never quite justify the price of, and she put the cup in front of her mother without saying anything about it. They sat there for a while. The afternoon had that quality it got in early spring, where the light looked cleaner than it actually was. "I've been thinking," Faye said, "about how you knew. You knew before any of the papers came in." "I suspected," Margot said. "From the deposition. Before I even knew him. From the deposition," Margot confirmed. "And from the years after, and from the way he stood behind you when you signed things." Faye looked at the coffee cup in her hands. "Why didn't you just tell me all of that directly?" It was a fair question. It was the question Margot had asked herself every version of for 4 years, and the answer was always the same answer, which was that she hadn't wanted to be the mother who told her daughter her husband was wrong for her, because that was a role that rarely produced the outcome you were hoping for and almost always cost you something you could not get back. "I tried," Margot said. "I didn't try hard enough." Faye nodded slowly. She didn't argue with that. After a moment, she said, "You know what he told me early on? He said you were the kind of person who thought she was the smartest one in any room." Margot looked at the yard. The neighbor's tree was doing what it did every March, putting out that aggressive, optimistic bloom. "Well," she said, "he wasn't entirely wrong." Faye laughed. It was the first time Margot had heard her daughter laugh in what felt like a very long time, and it landed somewhere in her chest, the way sounds do when you've been waiting for them. They finished their coffee in the quiet. If you've ever had someone close to you look at a situation and tell you it was fine, tell you to stop worrying, stop asking questions, stop making things harder than they needed to be, and you listened, and then found out later it wasn't fine at all. This story is about that, about the distance between suspicion and proof, about what you lose in the time it takes to cross it, about what it costs a mother to stay quiet because she loves her daughter more than she wants to be right. Margot didn't get to be a hero in the moment it counted. She got to be one in the long aftermath, which is usually how it actually works. If this story made you think about the people in your life who've been watching out for you in ways you haven't noticed yet, or made you think about what you should have said sooner, leave a comment below. We read all of them, and if you know someone who needs to hear this kind of story right now, share it with them. It costs nothing. And sometimes it's exactly what someone needs on a Tuesday morning before the day gets hard. Subscribe to Velvet Verdict, and we'll be here next time with another one.